Subscribe to Tops Educators and don't forget to on bell icon.
In this segment, we'll see how the French Revolution progressed. The situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Although Louis XVI had signed the constitution, he entered into secret negotiations with the King of Prussia. Rulers of the neighboring countries too were worried about the developments in France and made plans to send troops to put down events that had been taking place since the summer of 1789. Before this could happen, the National Assembly voted in April 1792 to declare a war against Prussia and Austria. Thousands of volunteers thronged from the provinces to join the army. They saw this as a war of people against kings and aristocracies all over Europe. Among the patriotic songs they sang was the Marseillaise, composed by the poet Roger de Lisle. The Marseillaise is now the national anthem of France. As the Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to richer sections of society, political clubs became an important rallying point for the people who wished to discuss important government policies and plan their own forms of action. The most successful of these clubs was that of the Jacobians in Paris. The members of Jacobian Club belonged mainly to less prosperous sections of society that included small shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants and daily wage workers. Their leader was Maximilien Robespierre, who would go on to become the reason of Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. A large group among the Jacobians decided to start wearing long striped trousers similar to those worn by dock workers. This was to set themselves apart from the fashionable sections of society, especially the nobility, who wore knee breeches. It was a way of proclaiming the end of the power wielded by the wearers of knee breeches. These Jacobians came to be known as sans-culottes, literally meaning those without knee breeches. Sans-culottes men wore in addition the red cap that symbolized liberty. Women, however, were not allowed to do so. In the summer of 1792, the Jacobians planned an insurrection of a large number of Parisians who were angered by the short supplies and high prices of food. On the morning of August 10th, they stormed the Paris of Tuileries, massacred king's guards, and held the king himself as hostage for several hours. Later, the assembly voted to imprison the royal family, which was a turning point in the French history. Elections were held. From now on, all men of 21 years and above, regardless of wealth, got the right to vote. The newly elected assembly was called the Convention. On 21st September 1792, it abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. On 21st January 1793, he was executed publicly, Place de la Concorde. The Queen Mary, Antoinette, met with the same fate shortly after. Both of them were put under the guillotine. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. Maximilien Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. All those whom he saw as being enemies of republic, ex-nobles and clergy, members of other political parties, even members of his own party who did not agree with his methods, were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal. Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Meat and bread were rationed. Peasants were forced to transport their grain to cities and sell it at prices fixed by the government. Churches were shut down and their buildings became barracks and offices. But the tyranny of Robespierre would come to end soon. Robespierre pursued his policies so relentlessly that even his supporters began to demand moderation. Finally, he was convicted by a court in July 1794, arrested, and on the next day sent to the guillotine and executed. The fall of Jacobean governments allowed the wealthier middle class to seize power. A new constitution was introduced which denied the vote to non-propertied sections of society. It provided for 2 elected legislative councils. These then appointed a directory, an executive made up of 5 members. This was meant as a safeguard against the concentration of power in one-man executive as under the Jacobean. However, the directors often clashed with the legislative councils, who then sought to dismiss them. The political instability of the directory paved the way for the rise of military dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. What are the takeaways from French Revolution? Through all these changes in the form of government, the ideals of freedom, of equality before the law, and fraternity remained inspiring ideals that motivated political movements in France and the rest of Europe during the following century. Did women have a role in revolution? Of course they did. From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events which brought about so many important changes in French society. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. Most women of the third estate had to work for a living. Most women did not have access to education or job training. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the third estate would study at a convent, after which their families arranged a marriage for them. In order to discuss and voice their interests, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. About 60 women's clubs came up in different French cities. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous of them. One of their main demands was that women enjoy the same political rights as men. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them to passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly, and to hold political office. Only then, they felt, would their interests be represented in the new government. In the early years, the revolutionary governments did introduce laws that helped improve the lives of women. Together with creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Their fathers could no longer force them into a marriage against their will. Divorce was made legal and could be applied for by both women and men. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists, or run small businesses. Women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued. During the Reign of Terror, the new government issued laws ordering closure of women's clubs and banning their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them executed. Women's movements for voting rights and equal wages continued through the next 200 years in many countries of the world. The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The example of the political activities of French women during the revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. Now let us come to a very sensitive topic of slavery. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of Jacobean regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. The colonies were in the Caribbean, for example, Martinique, Guadeloupe, San Domingo. They were all important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. But the reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar lands meant a shortage of labor on the plantations. So this was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The slave trade began in the 17th century. The exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo possible. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Throughout the 18th century, there was a little criticism of slavery in France. The National Assembly held long debates about whether or not the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in colonies. But it did not pass any laws, fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade. It was finally the convention which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions. This, however, turned out to be a short-term measure. 10 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte reintroduced slavery. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies almost 50 years later in 1848. Now let us understand how the French Revolution affected the everyday life. The years following 1789 in France saw many changes in lives of men, women and children. The revolutionary governments took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. In the old regime, all written material and cultural activities, books, newspapers, plays could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Now, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded the towns of France from where they traveled rapidly into countryside. They all described and discussed the events of politics. Freedom of press also meant that opposing views of events could be now expressed. Each side sought to convince the others of its positions through the medium of print. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted large numbers of people. This was one way they could grasp and identify ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in texts which only a handful of educated people could read. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself as the Emperor of France. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed members of his own family. Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Initially, many saw Napoleon as liberator who would bring freedom for the people. But soon, the Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. He was finally defeated at Waterloo by the British in 1815. Many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe had an impact on the people long after Napoleon had left. Thank you.
Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left.